Hello, my online learners. Today we are going to continue looking at biological molecules, and today we're going to focus on proteins. And what we're going to do with our proteins is again look at the structure, the function, and examples. Now, proteins are very important because this is a beautiful example how shape is important. So we will look at shape. So when I refer to the video that we were looking at earlier, we see that proteins are made up of small, almost like beads on a string. And we still have carbon, we still have hydrogen, we still have oxygen, but now we have another molecule of nitrogen. And also there is what's called this R group, and this R group makes up the differences between each of what's called the amino acids. So let's listen for a bit about the structure.
Proteins are made from long chains of amino acids. Amino acids all have a similar structure with carboxyl and amino functional groups.
Okay, so a carboxyl group is the C double bond O, OH, and the amino group is this nitrogen group. And we will look at it later because it's this nitrogen group that is actually toxic when it's broken down, and that's why you have urea and urine and why you need to pee it out. But all amino acids have this amino group and this carboxyl group.
What makes each amino acid unique is the presence of a variable, or R group. The R group gives each amino acid its chemical properties. Amino acids are linked together by peptide bonds, forming long polypeptide chains. As these chains form, the polypeptide develops multiple levels of structure, which contribute to its overall shape.
Okay, we talked about shape being important, so let's look at it in a little more detail. So, the amino acid is the, is the repetitive group in the protein. And there are 20 amino acids, just sort of like the letters in an alphabet will make up words, and words can make up sentences, and sentences make up paragraphs, and paragraphs can have different ideas. This is sort of how proteins work. So proteins, you start with the primary structure, which is just the coding of the amino acid as set out by the DNA molecules. Then the secondary interaction has to do with the coiling, making alpha helixes, or what are called these beta pleated sheets. And look, see these hydrogen bonds? It is the interaction between the hydrogen on one set, usually the one attached to the nitrogen, and the double bonded O oxygen that creates these special structures, either the pleated sheets or the alpha helixes. And this is called the secondary structure. Then these will then go and form globulins, and this is the tertiary structure. So one more level of structure. And this structure here will then be an interaction of ionic bonds, an interaction of hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions, and that will form a tertiary. Then you can put groups of these tertiary or peptides. So we have beads on a string is primary, beta pleated sheets and alpha is secondary, tertiary is a globulin, and then if you put many globulins together, you get a quaternary structure. And this is the beautiful example is hemoglobin, which is 4 different polypeptides. So it's the building of these that give them the shape. And the shape is determined mainly by the interactions of the R groups or of the nitrogen. Because nitrogen is larger than hydrogen, nitrogen will hog the electrons, making the nitrogen slightly negative. Sorry, nitrogen is larger than hydrogen. It will cause the electrons to be pulled towards nitrogen, making the hydrogen slightly positive. Now, being slightly positive, it's going to go out and look for electrons, and that's where this double bond O has these bonding electrons on the outside. So they will form hydrogen bonds. Good. So when we're talking about the structure of proteins, we start with amino acids. Amino acids will then interact to form a secondary structure, a tertiary structure, and a quaternary structure. And this is why shape is very important. Okay, we've talked about the structure of proteins. We've talked about how amino acids are the monomer or the repeating unit of proteins, but we never really looked at the examples or the function of proteins. Proteins have many, many functions. Now, you may know when you're eating your protein, you're eating chicken, which is muscle. Beef is muscle. So that is a good, muscles are a great example of proteins. They can be building blocks, such as the structure in almonds. That is a protein, or in beans, they're a protein. And the proteins have many other structures. Your hair is protein, your skin is protein, and proteins will also make up enzymes, which are chemicals that make reactions occur faster, antibodies, which help fight disease, and they are also used in speeding up chemical reactions. So we will look at that later. And just to reiterate here from the textbook, there are 20 different amino acids that combine into long chains. Okay, a little summary that I made on the biological molecules note page, or I started with the biological molecules note page. So when we're talking about proteins, they have a structure of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they also contain nitrogen and sulfur. Shape is very important with proteins, and you have the primary shape, which is just the order of the amino acids, like bead on a string or bead on a chain. And then secondary is due to hydrogen bonding. And due to hydrogen bonding, you have alpha helixes and pleated sheets, which change the shape. Then there's also a tertiary structure, which is when they create a polypeptide, which is many peptides together, and the globulins will then interact, and they will form, based on ionic charges, positive and negative interactions, hydrophobic and hydrophilic areas. And we'll talk more about hydrophobic and hydrophilic as we talk about channels in membranes. And then there's a quaternary structure, which talks about globulins and polypeptides. Here we have the term poly again, meaning many. And that creates a unique 3D shape, which is very important for things like hemoglobin and also for something like enzymes. So when we're talking, there's many things used for support, function, communication, energy activity. Examples are muscle and hair is a protein, antibodies, channels in your membranes, enzymes is another thing we'll look at later. So that's a bit of a summary. Take a second and make sure your note page is filled out. And then next, lipids.